All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Taylor. I'm the communication GA here for ICAT, and I'd like to welcome you all to the Playdate today. So we are filming, so any question that you ask at the end will be online forever, and so just be mindful of that. And hello to anyone who's watching online today. There is a sign-in sheet going around. That's how we justify having donuts and coffee here at ICAT. So please make sure that you sign in before you leave. At the end of the presentation today, we're gonna be having questions. I'll come around with the mic. I'll just hold it for you, if that's all right. If you need professional development today, Holly is back there. It's also her birthday, so say happy birthday to her when you see her. Yeah, if you didn't hear, there's a QR code at the bottom, so you can use that to also sign in. So without further ado, today we have Noor, and he will be talking about his project. He just performed at the Torpedo Factory. It's called Embodied Art.
Thank you. All right, cool. So hey everyone. Thanks for coming out today. I know it's a pretty rainy, cold morning, so I appreciate a lot of you coming in. And so, as was mentioned, my name is Noor, and I'm a PhD student in the Translational Biology, Medicine, and Health program. So it's like an interdisciplinary biomedical sciences program based over in Carillion in the Fralin Biomedical Research Institute in Roanoke. But we had the pleasure of running a project called Embodied Art. And so it was a project that was funded by the ICAT Student Seed Grant program. And so if there are students here who are interested in that program, I can happily talk more about that. But this wouldn't have been possible without the resources and support from ICAT, and it was cool that we were able to pull this off as students. So I was the PI over on this project, but we also had a transdisciplinary team, and that consisted of Suraj Bhatia. He was in architecture, art, and design. We had Ben Bider in mechanical engineering, Teresa Lubera and Robin Hansen. They're in the BEAM department, or biomedical engineering mechanics. And we were advised by Dr. Julia Basso, who's an assistant professor in the Human Nutrition, Foods, and Exercise program. And so with this project, and when we proposed this project to ICAT, we were pretty much interested in seeing how we can look at body function through art and science. And there's so many different ways in which you can go about that. But one of the main fields that I was very much interested in is neuroaesthetics. And so with neuroaesthetics, that entire field looks at what the brain is doing when we are responding to art, when we're looking at art. And so we were kind of interested in this bi-directional relationship, right? And so like, how does the brain respond to art? But also, how does the art respond to the brain, right? And so kind of just like creating like this entire like feedback loop through our project. And that goes into another concept in neuroscience that I've been working with called neurofeedback. And so with any sort of biofeedback or neurofeedback, when you're measuring any aspect of body physiology, or particularly brain physiology, this sort of brain physiology can be transformed. And so we can look at some sort of visual representation of brain activity, or we can look at some sort of audio representation of brain activity as well. But when you see that representation in some sort of artistic form, whether that's visual or audio, your brain is responding to that as well, right? So at the same time, while your brain's creating, it's also responding. So that's why we were interested in neurofeedback and neuroaesthetics. And so putting all that together, we had myself, an EEG or electroencephalography expert in graduate school. We had Suraj, who was very much in architecture and design, and then we had a bunch of these engineers, and we were just like, all right, how do we take what's going on within their brain and represent it through any sort of like artistic form, but outside of the brain as well? The brain is controlling motion, right? Is there any sort of way in which we can represent motion through an artistic form as well? And so those were all the goals that we had coming into this project through the Seed Grant program. And so I'll kind of be piecing apart all those different aspects of this performance, and then we'll actually be able to watch a little preview of that performance that we hosted in the Cube back in May. And then as was mentioned too, we were also able to have this presentation over at the Torpedo Factory Art Center in Alexandria a few weeks ago, maybe a month-ish ago. Time's a blur right now. So looking into the brain. And so as I mentioned earlier, we use this technology called electroencephalography. Of course, it's a mouthful. so it's also commonly known as EEG. And so you can see myself actually wearing this in the cube right here to the left. You can see Dr. Basso helping prep that EEG cap on me to the right. And what's cool about EEG is that it consists of electrodes, right? And so when we think about the brain, it consists of billions of cells called neurons. And when they're communicating with each other, they're communicating with each other in these rhythmic electrical pulses. And this is happening in like in a millisecond time scale. And so this EEG device itself, it's recording that electrical activity 500 times per second. So like every 2 milliseconds. And so with this rhythmic communication between neurons within like the outer layer of the brain, we were thinking like, hey, like if this has some sort of like rhythmicity to it, could we somehow transform this into music? And as we were diving deeper into the processes and like the pre-processing pipelines that are typically used in electrical engineering for EEG and brain data, we started realizing that those are the same exact techniques that are used to process sound. And so what was interesting is that we had to figure out, all right, how do we pull this brain data out of this black box of a proprietary system and bring it into open source software to bring in some of the typical techniques that are used for sound processing to actually turn it into sound. And so just giving you an idea of like what this EEG data looks like, it can be represented in many different ways. So one is through this topographical format. And so typically when I'm working with EEG data in the lab, I'm looking at it by like a second by second time scale. And so you can see it's divided into like 250 milliseconds within this 1 second time scale. And it's creating like this sort of heat map based on like electrical activity on top of the scalp. And so when you're looking at this little circle, that little arch in front is the nose. You see the little ears on the side. And it looks kind of silly, but it's typically how EEG data is represented when you're looking at this topographical time point. And so this is actually a video. And so I'm just gonna play it, and you'll see like how much the brain is changing in terms of electrical activity on a second by second time scale. And it should be going, there you go. And this is data that we've actually collected too from a previous protocol. And so you can see that, again, like it's just dynamic, right? And as you can see here, those little like dots on top of the scalp, those are each electrode, right? And so that electrode itself is collecting electrical activity from thousands and billions of neurons within that single source, right? So it's grouping that activity together and representing it in like a time series data point. So the stream of data. So as you can imagine, that's a lot of data, right? So with our EEG caps, we have 32 data streams going on. And so with that, I just wanted to show you all, this is what the data looks like. So we have 32 channels bringing data in, but I wanted you to pay attention to what the data looks like. Because this is from the same exact individual, and you can kind of see those oscillations, right? Within the electrical activity, within every other channel. And so I'll stream along it, and I do also want you to notice that there is something that says blink all the way up top. That's because the electrical activity actually dips whenever we blink when we have EEG data on. And I want you all to take note of that because we were able to specifically utilize that as an instrument when we did sonified brain data. And so you just take a quick look at this, but this is again like another stream of just me scrolling through the data, but you can kind of see that oscillatory activity, right? And so with that electrical fluctuation that goes on within the brain activity, we're hoping to utilize that oscillation to produce some sort of sound. So that is a brief overview of kind of what we did with the sonification pipeline for this performance. But in addition to that, and as you all may have seen in the video that's on YouTube now and through social media and stuff, there was a huge visual component to this performance as well. And what we wanted to do is that we were very much inspired by the way in which we understand brain activity and look at brain activity. So with electroencephalography, we are particularly looking at the electrical activity within the brain. But there's another sort of method called functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, right? And that is typically looking at the hemodynamic response within the brain, but also otherwise known as the blood activity within the brain as well. And so when you're looking at fMRI scans, it's looking at how blood is rushing into a certain part of the brain. So we were also very much interested in that aspect of brain imaging, and we wanted to be able to visually represent that within our performance. So if you look closely, we have Melissa Leib, who's the star performer of the performance at the Cube, and you see this image of the brain right underneath her. And so we were actually able to utilize the floor projections in the Cube, excitingly, to this project as well. And you can see kind of like the sort of rush of pink right underneath her. So what we ended up doing is using this technique called projection mapping, and we were able to map our motion onto the floor of the Cube. And it's pretty interesting because we were actually able to use a Microsoft Connect V2 that Suraj actually found at the thrift store to help run this performance. And so again, you don't need the exact fanciest equipment to make art, right? And it was great. And so we actually had, and I'll show the video of the performance soon, we had to connect right behind the performers, tracking our motion, and then we use a forward projection to project that motion onto the floor. And so the sort of shadow in this point cloud, specifically that was developed by the Connect, was tracing us as we were on top of the brain, right? So kind of what you would see in an fMRI imaging scan of seeing blood flow transcend within the brain. And so, again, and I want to give credit to Suraj, because Suraj pretty much took charge of that pipeline. And I'll talk a little bit more about the process as well, but he mainly used Touch Designer with the Connect to make that happen. And so now I'm about to play the performance, and so I just want to give you all a brief overview of what you're about to see. And so Melissa was a star performer, as I mentioned earlier, and the first minute or so of the performance, she's sitting in this meditative state. And so all the sounds that you were hearing, the twinkling behind the scenes, that is the sound of her brain activity. And then we also try to utilize the eye blinks as well to create instruments. And so some of the eye blinks you'll see throughout the performance, there'll be crotales, there were either xylophones, so kind of like these like high-pitched instruments as well. And so I'll probably scroll around the video because it is like 11 minutes long, and I don't want to take up too much time, but I'll let you all kind of just look through it. Melissa was primarily performing by herself at the beginning, and then we had her do duets, one with me, one with Dr. Basso, and then we did a whole trio within the performance, and then she did her own solo at the end where we could hear her brain activity again by itself and just kind of compare through audio what her brain was doing differently. And that's one thing that I'm also very much interested in too, is that, you know, we talk about how much science can like put into art, but like art can also drive so much creativity and innovation within science. And I think, especially within the neuroscience realm as well, a lot of us neuroscientists, when we're looking at EEG and brain activity data, you can only look at so much visually, but now we are starting to utilize sonification to hear if there's anything different going on within the brain as well. And so that's kind of what also inspired our project. So I'm gonna play this video, and I'll scroll along a little bit. So this is all her brain activity. You can see kind of her shadow point cloud on the brain. And we eventually have some backing tracks that also eventually come in to the performance as well. But right now, this is just her brain. You can kind of see like the point cloud tracing her as well. You can kind of get the backing tracks in the back. And now I'm going to scroll through this video a little bit. So what was cool about the projections is that they were able to also track multiple people within that space. So obviously that's me, and then Dr. Basso eventually came in. And you can still hear like the twinkling in the background too when we're hearing her brain activity. And one thing that we wanted to do was spatialize the audio so that the backing tracks were closer to the performers, but the EEG activity and sonification was much closer to the audience members. So you can also hear how much the brain is changing as they're performing. And then I'm gonna just scroll towards the end of this video. And then it'll eventually end with just us hearing her brain activity. And it sounds, I mean, from a subjective point of view, I think it does sound somewhat different. And we were able to kind of dive deeper into the data too afterwards, after this performance. So that was the entire video. It is on YouTube if you all are interested in looking at it, but if you just search Embodied Art ICAT on YouTube, you should be able to see it. So I was very mesmerized about like how the sound came out by this final performance. But that wasn't always the case. So I do want to highlight the process and the steps that we took to finally get to that point. So our first sound samples, and so I'll go a little bit over our pipeline now, is that we use a system called Brain Vision. And again, that's like proprietary software. And we were trying to figure out how do we get this EEG data out of this device and stream it in real time. And so they do have ways in which you can remotely access the data. You can use Python, you can use like other languages. Many of us are engineers here at Tech, and we are very familiar with MATLAB, and given the time constraints, we ended up using MATLAB, which again, isn't open source, but that is the next step in our pipeline. And so using MATLAB, we were finally able to use pre-recorded data and use the audio toolbox in MATLAB to turn it into like this 8-bit sound. And so what I'll play for you is like the first sample of like what we had. And just an FYI, it is a little high pitched. I think Brandon, we took care of the volume. So let's see how it sounds. So yeah. Yeah, so very different from what we ended up with, right? But again, it was like this 8-bit sound, and we were just trying to take like the raw electrical activity and just see like what it would sound like. And the second version that we had, it sounds very similar as well, so I'm not gonna drag it out too long. So after we had that, we were like, all right, cool. There's a way in which we can manipulate this electrical activity from the brain and turn it into sound. But then we eventually started messing around a little bit more with MATLAB, and we were like, all right, how do we take the sound from MATLAB and get it into open sound control, and then, which is like another sort of pipeline, and get it over into Max MSP, where we can use more advanced like sound engineering techniques to actually make it sound a little bit more pleasant, get it on like a MIDI scale, and transform it into like different musical instruments. And so we were able to do that, and so the first iteration of this, when we eventually got it onto Max MSP, was playing it through a piano on the typical MIDI scale. And this is me when we first finally figured out how to do it, and I'm just like moving around with it, just seeing like, hey, like what is it gonna sound like? And we bumped the audio up too a little bit on this. And this is just me kind of just like messing around, like bringing in like motion artifacts. But this is the Perform Studio over at the Moss Arts Center. Some of you all may be familiar with it. But you can just hear the piano just like constantly like hitting because of the electrical activity in the brain. And you can see me blinking too to play around with the eye blinks. Yeah. Yeah, so I was just like, all right, Stuart's like, does this work? And we were like, all right, it does work. So then we were like, all right, like now we can bring it into Logic Pro. And so Seward was very comfortable with Logic Pro, and we were able to kind of take this pipeline and export these sounds from MIDI into different instruments in Logic Pro and actually be able to kind of mess around with the music live during the performance, whether that was in the Cube or over in Alexandria in the Torpedo Factory Arts Center. So the last component that I'll be talking about is the projection mapping as well. And so, again, like as I mentioned earlier, Suraj was able to use this through the Microsoft Connect, and you can kind of see it in the background right there, that little black bar under the projection. And yeah, I mean, it did a great job in terms of just like actually like tracing our movement. And I think we had a huge nice like visual component to this as well, using the point cloud on a back projection over at Torpedo Factory, so like that, so that the audience members could see it a little bit more properly too, based on the lighting at the venue. And so again, Suraj was able to use the Microsoft Connect V2 Touch Designer and point cloud projections just to be able to make this happen. And it was a fairly straightforward pipeline too on Touch Designer. So in terms of next steps, well, actually before we get there, this is a few images from the Torpedo Factory Arts Center as well. And so you can see multiple people being traced on top of the brain. And we were trying to be intentional with the colors that we were using as well, because typically you kind of see like this like reddish, yellow, bluish color on a lot of fMRI imaging, and we want to use similar colors as well when we were playing around with the projections. And so you can see all of our projections being traced here over at Torpedo Factory Arts Center. Rachel Rue, who's faculty in School of Performing Arts, was able to step in for Melissa for this performance, so a big thank you to her. Yeah, and a big thank you to ICAT for letting us perform this over at Torpedo Factory Arts Center. And so the last thing we wanted to do was incorporate motion capture for this as well. And so what we're interested in right now is like seeing like how the brain produces music, right? But can we alter that music somehow based on our motion as we're moving around in this immersive space? And so Robin and Teresa, they're both in the Granada lab here in the Beam Department of Virginia Tech, and so they're very much experts in motion capture, particularly through retroreflective markers that you can see on my body right here. And so using that, could we somehow utilize motion to alter the gain or volume of the music being produced, or even the pitch as well? And I think we did record some data in the studio with me like moving around with these motion capture markers. So we're hoping to implement those pipelines in the future when it comes to sonification. And so with that being said, we can take some questions, but I did want to note, I think the ICAT staff finds it very amusing that I think most of the times that you all have seen me has been wearing a EEG cap around the Moss Arts Center. And I've had to walk around Virginia Tech's campus in Blacksburg numerous times with just dry EEG gel on all over my hair. And I'm very grateful because so many Virginia Tech students will look at you, but they will never ask a question. They'll just keep walking. So I've had so many awkward stares, but no one's really talked to me about it. So, and I think Melissa and I think we ended up going to Greens afterwards looking like this too. Again, no questions asked, so. But you are more than available to ask questions now regarding this process. So I think we're good. Thank you.
Thank you, Noor. We have a question from online, and that is, how did you decide what musical instrumentation to use for different brain activity?
Yeah, so at the moment it was a little random. Well, not entirely random, because when we looked at the brain activity in particular, right, you can represent it in different frequency bands. And so if it's on a lower frequency scale, we call that delta rhythm or delta waves. If it gets a little faster, you go to like theta, beta, alpha, and so on. And so we were actually able to implement a pipeline within MATLAB in real time that can extract that understanding, also known as like power of the frequency bands, and use that power within our MIDI scale. So through Max MSP, or otherwise known as Max, you can scale these numerical values that are coming in into like another scale as well, right? And so we wanted to like kind of like play around with instruments between I think 41 and 96 on the MIDI scale, based on the power values that we were seeing from different frequency bands. So that was influencing what was happening in the MIDI, but then for the actual instruments that we're using in Logic Pro, we honestly were just using like whatever we thought was sounding nice But if you all did notice in the performance, there was different music like all throughout the tracks. And so we wanted it to be a little bit more representative of what our performers wanted. Melissa and I particularly, I mean, we wanted something a little bit more fast-paced. Dr. Basso wanted something a little bit more slow-paced. And based off of what our performers wanted, we ended up just using some like arbitrary instruments based on what the performers wanted.
Thank you for the presentation. My question is more directed towards you as a performer, and as you were doing this, were these projections, brain projections, representing your internal state in a certain way or the other?
Yeah.
So that's the question. Are these representations or projections a reflection of your internal state?
Yes, so as a representation of my internal state, I would say yes, technically, because my internal state is driving my motion, and that motion is being projected. But when it comes to like the actual like physiological state and like the quantitative state, it wasn't representative, right? I mean, it was just tracking my motion. That's not to say that's not possible. So another thing that we're also investigating is we were able to take this brain data out into open sound control. And that data can be taken from open sound control and driven into Touch Designer through Max MSP as well. So we've already done the hard part of taking this data out, but there's also a way in which we can use open sound control to actually utilize the brain data to drive what's going on top of the brain through the projections. I will say, the projections themselves, I think it was a little bit representative of my motion, but I was trying not to pay attention to them too much as a performer. Especially when we were at Torpedo Factory Arts Center, like if I turned around, I could see the projection, right? But I didn't want it to drive my motion because I didn't want to play around with it too much because I want to be fully present in the state and be aware of like the performers around me and the piece that I was performing, rather than letting it, like rather the visual driving my motion. Did that answer your question?
I guess the takeaway point from your answer is that the projections were not driving the performance. You had this performance planned, and you were doing it, and the performance reflected your internal state. It was not the other way around.
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah. And that was at least with the projections, right? The sonification, completely different story, because that was actually driven by the physiological data and what our brains were doing at the moment. Yeah.
Thanks so much for the presentation. I found it really interesting. I really like that you mentioned that one of the goals was to basically leverage technologies that are open source as much as possible. Is it a goal in the future to actually do pipelining work with something like Prometheus or otherwise to accomplish that in the future to make it more accessible to people? And then a second question that I have is just, I found it really interesting, the concept of the blink and kind of how that influences the EEG inputs or whatever, the amplitude of data collected. I'm sure I'm botching the terminology there, but what it makes me think of is channels as well as just sensory inputs being different channels. So are there any plans in the future to perhaps eliminate visual input, such as having people's eyes closed for studies to actually study more of like a kinesthetic awareness and kind of hearing inputs to eliminate some of the influences of visual input?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first question in terms of just like making it open source, and then we'll get into like the second question about like other future steps regarding the pipeline. Yes, I'm a big proponent of that. Unfortunately, with my training, I've only really been experienced with MATLAB. And so given the timeline, that's where we're like, all right, like we all know this, we can get this out within like the 1-year time frame within the ICAT Student Seed Grant. I am actively learning Python. So there is a hope to kind of export this. And I think it will honestly like introduce less latency or less lag when I'm working with Python as well. And a lot of these other programs too, like especially like Max and so on, they're also a little bit more open to like using Python data inputs rather than MATLAB. I will say I think there is still a financial barrier when it comes to this project, mainly because of the EEG caps themselves. They can be thousands of dollars, especially like the types that we have here. So again, I think that financial barrier will always be there, but the best that we can do, at least from my position right now, is try to make the pipeline open source and then eventually get it on GitHub and be like, hey, everyone, let's make some music together. There have been some other individuals who've been doing that already with their different EEG devices, and they've also been a little bit more Python-based. The second question in terms of just being a little bit more representative, eyes closed and other internal states, yes, we also want to be able to do that as well. I think that a lot of that comes down to fine-tuning the pre-processing pipeline in MATLAB, because with EEG data, it can get really noisy. If you're moving around, introduces motion artifacts. Different types of hair, like scalp thickness as well, right? Also introduces different types of artifact as well. And so we want to be able to fine-tune that pre-processing pipeline to make sure the electrical data that's coming out and being represented as sound is actually representative of what's going on in the brain and not noise. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of that as well.
Awesome. That was our last question.
Awesome.
Everyone, can we have a round of applause for Noor?
Oh, thanks.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Cool. I'll be hanging out here, so if there's other lingering questions.